Don't forget that you can now listen to the Politicrat podcast on Audible at audible.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe now. And thank you for your support. Welcome to the Politicrat. I am Omar Moore. It is Saturday, December the 5th, 2020.
So all of these men knew how to be what the country needed them to be at that time, what their enablers needed them to be at that time. And this is really important. So they're shapeshifters. They will be what you need them to be. And this goes into these partnerships with their enablers. So if we take Trump and the GOP, as you say, they were already heading in a authoritarian direction, and you have let's take the Christian right, where Trump is the least likely person to be embraced by the Christian right, and evangelicals laying their hands on him. This is, he's the most profane person, but all of them are like that, and they're all opportunists who will gladly give their partners what they want, because they don't have any inner morals or principles themselves. Their only principle is power.
On this edition of The Politicrat, a conversation with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history at New York University. We will be conversing about her brand new book, Strongmen, Mussolini To The Present. That conversation is coming up right after this. Omar Moore here, saying thank you so much for your support during this calendar year. Every single day since the middle of March of this year, I've recorded an episode of this podcast. The podcast is in 29 countries, and it's going to grow with your help and your continued support. So thank you very much. Much appreciated. I really do admire and respect you all for your time, for your listening ear, and your feedback, and all the platforms that you can listen on, including Audible, Amazon Music, Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and so many others. Thank you so very much for your support. It means the world to me. And please subscribe to this podcast and spread the word about the Politicrat Daily Podcast. Thank you very much. My guest here on the Politicrat Podcast is Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. And she has a brand new book out. It's called Strongmen, Mussolini To The Present. And welcome back to the Politicrat, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Most welcome, most welcome. To talk about your book, but before we do, you had written a column in CNN at CNN.com about Biden and Harris and how they can overturn this misogynistic agenda that Donald Trump has had these last few years. Can you just say a few things about that? Because, of course, we've now had this election. I would like you, if you could, please, to talk about that briefly.
Sure. I think that we're in this kind of odd transition where we have a president who hasn't really conceded, although he's lost the election. And, even liberal world leaders like Modi of India and Erdogan in Turkey have called Biden to congratulate him, but the GOP, is still supporting Trump's fiction that somehow he didn't lose. So we're in this odd transition, but we are heading toward a new presidency. And so I wanted to call attention that this could be a chance to repair not only certain, corruption loopholes, and a certain form of government that would be better, more good government than government that doesn't care about people, but also gender roles. And we've been in this very unusual situation to have somebody who's, a sexual assaulter, a misogynist, who has made that part of his political brand. So it's not just that, which would be bad enough that he had these things he did in private life. He has used misogyny and insulting women, as he's used racism as part of his kind of brand of male glamour and lawlessness. And many people responded well to that. So it became part of his marketing strategy from the time he was a candidate. So we don't even know, probably until he really leaves, how much we've been exhausted by him, and how difficult it's been to have this kind of person set the tone for the presidency. So it's so hopeful to see the first cabinet appointments and the type of people, and have a vice president of color, a woman, for the first time. So I wanted to write about the potential for repair and healing and progress in the gender frame as well.
And those are very critical and very, very important. And your book, Strongmen, Mussolini To Present, and I do urge all listeners to get a copy of this book. Please buy it. It's available in all the usual places, and of course in independent bookstores. Support those, please, as well. And I will put all kinds of links in this episode to how you can get a copy of Ruth's book, how you can purchase it. One of the things that you talk about, and congratulations on this book, it is a really detailed, incisive, and very carefully presented history of around a century or so of men who behave with the most toxic masculinity, and in ways that they center that masculinity that's toxic in their own power and descendancy in order to take control and really wreck governments, destroy countries, and harm lots of people. One of the things you start out with in your book is this really interesting relationship. It seems actually quite homoerotic, a relationship between Berlusconi and Vladimir Putin. And Berlusconi, as people know, is an owner of a lot of media, or had been, or is still, in Italy. Can you talk about that? Because that seems really peculiar, and it tacks into what you just talked about misogyny as well, and the way that the two of them view women in the way that they do.
Yeah, so I was going to have a chapter called Partners, where I talk about foreign policy and how important this male bonding of these similar characters has been, but it would have taken even more time. So I integrated it throughout the book. And I start the book with this scene where the night that Obama was going to be elected, most world leaders were staying up to see the results. And Berlusconi, who he had a sex addiction, not on the level of Mussolini and Gaddafi, but he had one. So he was with an escort, and he was preparing, for sex, and these are wiretapped conversations. And so he tells her to wait for him at Putin's bed, because Putin gave him a bed, and they were very, very good friends. And there were many similarities with Trump's relationship with Putin, although these two were really friends and more equals, and Berlusconi didn't owe Putin, or didn't whatever investments he didn't have the same. He was much better off financially. He wasn't in debt to Russians and didn't depend on Russian investment. So these two had a kind of male bonding that actually influenced foreign policy, and Russian foreign policy toward Russia ended up being taken over personally by Berlusconi and his envoy, who was like a Giuliani type figure. called Valentino Valentini, who would travel to Russia several times on a month on Berlusconi's behalf. And it was all very mysterious. And the Foreign Office, the diplomats, were X'd out of this completely. So I start with this because they had this bond of virility. So Putin gifted him a bed, and then he gifted Putin a duvet with their faces on it, so they could ideally sleep under their own faces together. But it affected their foreign policy. So it's kind of it is this kind of special male bond, but it's deadly serious. And they would engage in this political theater together. So I think of when Trump, was sitting with Orban, and he said it's like we're twins, and both of them were kind of with these massive bodies. And or when Putin, walked hand in hand with Modi when Modi was visiting Russia. So there's this kind of theater of masculinity that's not only delivered to the leader's own people, but also influences foreign policy.
This is something that is certainly a thread, as you've pointed out, through many of these types of people. And what I noticed in your book as well, when you talk about Berlusconi in a bit more detail, his ownership of the media, as also how elections, you point out, first of all, for example, that a number of the cast of characters, and you talk about Mobutu and Gaddafi and Pinochet, who of course came in through the coup, it was assisted by the CIA in September 11th of 1973, of Salvador Allende in Chile, and others have come to power through military coups. And then you point out in your book also that at a certain period of time, post the 70s, post the 80s, a lot of these types of authoritarian types were coming in through elections. So they were gaining, I guess, a measure of legal means. But then, as you also point out in your book, these very same leaders would then seek to stay in power, and you point to Putin making an amendment to, I guess, the constitution there in Russia that would keep him in power until 2036. And you cite some other examples as well, as far as I remember when I read the book. Can you talk about that? Because that's really something that hinges upon the integrity of institutions, and we're seeing that with Donald Trump. And I'm sure that would have been a huge problem had he been in there for another 4 years.
Yeah, so the book, I really wanted to look back over 100 years of authoritarianism, and it's really an exploration in how it evolves. So that you could see that there are tools. I have these tools: propaganda, corruption, virility, and violence, and the myth of national greatness. And many things recur, but there are, of course, I isolate 3 ages. So you have the age of fascist takeovers and fascist regimes, and then the age of military coups, and then our own age, which starts with the end of the Cold War, I call new authoritarians. So they come in through elections, and they have to manipulate elections to stay in power. So they also engage, certainly with respect to somebody like Pinochet in Chile or the fascists, less public mass killing. They detain people, right? They have mass detention. But depending on elections changes the equation, and it means they're more dependent than ever on the manipulation of information. So Putin, in the propaganda chapter, I show how Putin has engaged in this political warfare, which it uses censorship, and indeed he has killed dozens of journalists. So he keeps stories and news he doesn't want out of the public realm, but he also tries to flood the zone. As Bannon says, flood the zone with shit, right? And Trump is using this same playbook, where the aim is to confuse people and spread rumors and conspiracy theories, and so it becomes very hard to know what to believe. And we're seeing this very much with Trump, and so everything is called into doubt, and that includes elections. And so Trump relitigating all the elections makes him feel powerful, and just extends this. Is it really the truth? is everything actually rigged that he's been doing since 2016? Because remember, he started this rigged election rhetoric in 2016 in case he lost. And had he lost, he was prepared to do the same kind of onslaught. He wouldn't have had the power to actually force recounts and things like that. But this is an old theme for him, and it's one of the saddest things is how he's domesticated the GOP in a really short period of time, considering it wasn't even his party. So like Berlusconi did the same, but Berlusconi founded his own party. He created his party, so it makes more sense. In a sense, Trump's been wildly more successful because he came from the outside, and then the GOP just does his bidding so that they can stay in power and, realize their agendas, including, so they're all going along with this fiction about this rigged election, which is highly dangerous.
Absolutely. And I've often thought, Ruth, that, and I certainly agree with you about them doing his bidding. In a very real sense, I also think he's doing theirs, as you point out. Mm-hmm. There's a pre-existing Republican agenda, and I've talked about this often here, that stretches back decades, where I think this is if you look back at everything, this is the quote-unquote logical point of where a Republican Party would be, and it certainly doesn't mind flaunting its very authoritarian and fascist wares. And it also depends, quite frankly, on a media. And you point to media with Berlusconi and others. I mean, Trump, NBC contracts, and Hitler had his own network, if I remember correctly. And Mussolini was once a columnist. And Boris Johnson, although I certainly wouldn't put Boris Johnson in the category of the people that you talk about. Boris Johnson had long been a columnist in the newspaper in England, and people in England, in my native country, are expressing a lot of concern about some of the things he's doing, although it's not on the mm-hmm. level of the people you chronicle.
Yeah, I think one of the things I didn't expect to find, because of course I knew Mussolini had been a journalist and Trump was in reality TV, but many of the ones who are successful either had a past in some kind of mass communications, mass persuasion. So Mobutu is in my book. He's a very interesting figure. Came to power through a coup in the Congo. He renamed it Zaire. He'd been a journalist. He's a really good journalist. So that's why they're able to do so well in presenting themselves to the public, in having slogans that kind of enrapture people if they're their followers. And even Putin, who was not a journalist, but he was a trained case officer for the KGB, and he was trained to kind of mirror his interlocutor. And so all of these men knew how to be what the country needed them to be at that time, what their enablers needed them to be at that time. And this is really important. So they're shapeshifters. They will be what you need them to be. And this goes into these partnerships with their enablers. So if we take Trump and the GOP, as you say, they were already heading in an authoritarian direction. And you have, let's take the Christian right, where Trump is the least likely person to be embraced by the Christian right, and evangelicals laying their hands on him. This is, he's the most profane person, but all of them are like that. And they're all opportunists who will gladly give their partners what they want, even because they don't have any inner morals or principles themselves. Their only principle is power. So this is a recurring thing, and there were so many patterns. I didn't expect to find so many patterns. So Mussolini was a devout atheist. He was so anti-clerical. He was, a sex assaulter, like the last person to be embraced by the church. But he's the one who made the peace with the Vatican and created the Lateran Accords. And so throughout history, up to Trump being embraced by Orthodox Jews and evangelicals, you have this syndrome. But it starts with them knowing how to reach out to all kinds of people and be someone special for each of those constituencies.
One of the other things, and in the last few moments that we have, one of the other things that I did want to point at that really jumped out at me, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago, about this conflation and confusion and flooding the zone, as you referenced earlier. Mussolini did this, and you point that out in the book, using populist tactics and conflating nationalism and socialism and causing confusion there. Hitler, his party was the National Socialist Party, I believe. And that was something that I think caused some confusion. Can you talk about that a bit more, Ruth? About that, because some people hear socialism and don't realize National Socialism Party was Hitler, but it's a very different type of thing. It's not what people might think of socialism to be these days, correct?
Yeah, and it's there was this ambiguity by design at the very beginning of fascism, because Mussolini, who founded fascism, had been a socialist, but he got kicked out of the party, Socialist Party, in 1914 for supporting World War I, and then he founded the Fascist Combat Leagues in 1919, and then the Fascist Party in 1921. So a long time had gone by since he was a socialist, and the first and most consistent victims of fascism in both Italy and Germany were the left. So today, but the fact that this National Socialist has this name, and fascism contained, at the very, very beginning, doctrinally or ideologically, some remnants of socialism, allows the right today to have this talking point, which everybody from Dinesh D'Souza in the States to Bolsonaro in Brazil, they claim that fascism is a left-wing movement. And the reason they're doing that, you find this talking point all over the place, is so they could blame fascist violence on the left and give the right clean hands so they become innocent. So this is part of this. This is one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, because we're in a period of intense revisionism of authoritarian memory in ways that clean the hands and whitewash the violence that I'm mostly looking at right-wing authoritarians, although they had no monopoly, of course, on violence. So this is just one example. But this kind of ambiguity within fascism allowed them to have a very broad constituency, and that has remained in all of these leaders. This goes back to what we were saying before. They know how to attract very different kinds of people who normally wouldn't see themselves in the same leader, but that's because they can be different things to different people, and they're not interested in doctrinal coherence. They're only interested in getting to power and using people. So that's why they don't care if they've got, like Berlusconi's, his biggest support bases were housewives and gangsters and priests, businessmen, people who might not go together.
Right.
But they all do this, all of them. And it works. And so what we're seeing with Trump, it's the first book to put Trump in historical perspective. And all of the things we're seeing with Trump are come out of this history. And although I started the book because I already had written extensively on him being an authoritarian, I myself didn't expect so many things to be the same.
And you anticipated one of the final two questions I was going to quickly ask you about what things surprised you in your journey about writing the book. If there are other things beyond that, it would be great for you to add those. But was this book an especially different challenge or a different experience from the previous books that you have written in engaging in this subject matter? Because you have done a lot of work on this, but in terms of writing this particular book, did you find there to be any unique or different types of things that may have come up for you that were challenging or different? Or you talked about the insight or some surprises, but is there anything along that level that came up for you when you wrote this book?
Well, my other books, although they're they're always written in plain language. They were academic books, and this is really a book written for the public as part of this outreach that I'm doing. It's also a book that it's full of grim things, and I've always written on fascism, but perhaps like my last book was on fascist film propaganda. So you're always writing about violence, but you're writing through the kind of screen of a text. And here, I wanted to pay homage to the victims, and I have a chapter on resistance and how they fall. And I had the photographs of some of the victims with me while I wrote. So there were times it was a hard book to write because I was telling stories of people's lives in a very personal way. There's a lot of stories of family separation. I was very conscious of being, a woman writing about male sexual violence, institutionalized. Because first, when we're thinking about the virility chapter, and I talk about these sex systems, think about as though Jeffrey Epstein was the head of state, and he had the whole resources of the state for his operation, from secret police to propagandists to people hiding his secrets. And so this was hard to write as a woman, and I also felt, keenly that I'm a mother. So I was drawn to certain, there's a whole sub-theme of exile, and so families separations, people who have to flee and they don't know what's going on. They fear what's going on back home to their families. So that all of that was a challenge, and it was a relief to get to the resistance chapter, and even more relief to get to the chapter where how do you get rid of them at the end.
Right.
So it was a bit of a voyage to write this book.
Well, there's so many other things I wanted to ask you, including about patriarchy and how I think that's indispensable to all of this with this toxic masculinity. I think if you don't have a patriarchal system, I doubt very much that a lot of this even gets to happen. But of course, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, I could say one thing that's in common is these men tend to find favor after periods of great social emancipation, and this happens over and over around the world. And it could be racial equity, it could be workers' rights, but it's often always also gender progress in gender. Either think about what had happened under Obama's presidency. You had gender integration of the military, legalization of same-sex marriage. You'd had the first female presidential candidate, and this kind of gains in society. And so then these men like Trump come up who are overtly working to reestablish the patriarchal rights of male authority, and there's where they can partner with religious institutions very easily. So the reason some people ask me why I don't have female leaders in there, because I'm only interested in people who really damaged or, wrecked a democracy. But I could have mentioned Indira Gandhi, or, there's even Margaret Thatcher, who was the Iron Lady, quote unquote.
Right.
But I wanted to isolate this kind of, what you were saying, this toxic masculinity as a tool of rule, this virility as a tool of rule. And so I chose to focus on male leaders, although there's plenty of female perpetrators. It's certainly not a book that says men are bad and women are good. There's female torturers. There's all kinds of people in there.
Sure.
But that's one reason I made the choice to focus on male leaders, because the shoring up of patriarchy is so important.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for your time, Ruth. The book is Strongmen, Mussolini To The Present. Critically important book. For those of you listening, please, please, please run out to your bookstore, or really at this point in this pandemic, order it online. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, thank you so very much for your time here today on the Politicrat podcast.
Thanks for having me, Omar.
Thank you. Thank you very much again to Ruth Ben-Ghiat for her time on this edition of the Politicrat podcast. Again, she's the author of her brand new book, Strongmen from Mussolini to the Present. Really good book. It's such an important book to read, and does provide this very important overview of the last century or so of these kinds of very dangerous, very toxic, masculine people who really are a hazard to our health, our mental health, our physical well-being, and the integrity of any kind of government or any system that seeks to, in quote, be more democratic, small d democratic. So this book is a must, and this is the holiday season, so make sure, heck, this is a good one to put on your gift list. So please, I know that we're going through a pandemic at the moment, and things are tough, but I'm telling you, this book is well worth your time, and you can get it wherever books are sold, or you can go online and order it as well. So again, a special thanks to Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's been on the Politicrat podcast before to talk about this subject matter, and so I'm just really thankful that she came back to do this again, particularly with her book. So I urge you to read the book. Very highly recommend this book, and make sure that you do go out and get it. It makes a great gift. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.